For the final weekly overview, I've decided to go ahead and do something different. This week's reading is really all about understanding how to model or examine relationships amongst social variables, right? And so the logic of causation is the title of what you're going to be working on. But for this weekly video, I've decided the best way to approach that topic is to just go ahead and present a piece of my master's work. And again, so this has been a few years back now, but I think it's relevant just to give you a concrete example of how you might start to apply quantitative research. And hopefully somewhere in this you can kind of see the overlap with some of the things that you're working on, and maybe start to understand how we can move beyond descriptive statistics, which are really just kind of that introductory level of information, how we can actually start using these latent constructs to understand complex relationships amongst social variables that ultimately have an influence or impact, or can be used to have an impact on the programs that we're working in. In my particular work for my master's degree, I focused on farmland preservation efforts here in the Midwest. And I did this in a couple of different ways, and I'm only going to really present kind of the collaborative model or the quantitative modeling piece of this, but there were two other components to this thesis as well. The first involved a spatial analysis that looked at land cover data across the Midwest, or specifically across Indiana and Illinois, and looked out over, I believe in that study it was a 10-year period, comparing land cover from what at the time was 2005 data to 1995 data effectively. And what we determined is that between the two states that more than 1 million acres of farmland had been converted into housing developments during that 10-year period of time. So this really incredibly rapid rate of farmland loss. That was kind of paired with a lot of other people recognizing this was a pretty serious issue. And so the second objective, or the second part of my master's thesis, focused on doing a case study of a local initiative and going in and understanding the process that they were going through. And then the quantitative follow-up to that was that I was able to do a phone survey. And again, in a rural part of Indiana at a time when phone surveys were still a viable option for us. I don't believe that's actually the case anymore. This was a time where every house in the rural county I was working in had a home line that we could get access to more or less through the phone book. We did buy our sample, but that was where it came from. And so anyway, with that in mind, I'll just go ahead and pick up. I'm just going to go ahead and run you through the presentation, and hopefully this will give you some ideas of how to approach your own work. The next 3 slides are just to give you a brief overview of the land use pattern that we're observing here, just to give you an introduction to kind of the context for the problem we're addressing. So it all begins with step 1, where historically, level areas, so the easiest places to farm were cleared of trees, cleared of debris, and made ready for farming. The next step is what we're seeing currently, and actually, understanding that this was done before the housing crisis, but we're seeing this come back online now, is that we start seeing development signs come up, and and the real estate market picks up, and in many rural counties that are experiencing rapid growth, like the one I'm going to talk about here in a minute, you'll see a dozen of these vacant land for sale signs at any given rural intersection anywhere in the county. And basically what this is reflecting is that the land has become more valuable for new development than it was for existing farming operations. And finally, what we see now is that instead of growing crops, we're now growing houses on the previous land. And there's a couple of issues from the community's perspective about this. Is one, most of the new development is really unplanned development, meaning that there isn't the infrastructure, the schools, the roads, the utilities aren't put in a meaningful way, and so it's very expensive to service this. And in fact, studies have shown that for average residential development, and so this basically means that any homes under about $400,000, the local community actually subsidizes that, and so the amount spent on services is about $1.25 for every dollar of property tax collected from residential development. And so again, a big issue for rural communities that are already budget strapped. Despite the serious issue for Indiana farming due to loss of farmland to urban development, there was no support at the state level at this time, and to be honest, still continues to this day, that there was no support for any kind of top-down planning initiatives to address this problem. Actually, in Indiana, there was movement under a former governor, which is actually now 2 governors ago, and they'd made major strides with the ag community about how to come up with a farmland preservation plan. Something, to be honest, we do very well here in Wisconsin. And the new governor swept into office and swept away all of the reforms and all of the work that had been done. And basically what ended up happening was that they denied local communities who'd been working towards these goals any access to federal funding to help support those initiatives. You can see here in the quote that they tried to change the conversation and make it about something else. When the state support fell away, and with it the federal support that required a state commitment to farmland preservation, what we saw was the emergence of these local groups. So this grassroots initiatives where citizens were legitimately looking at their county and looking at the quality of life impacts on their county from rapid development. It's not that these counties were really against all development. It was the fact that developers had way too much control and power in these situations. Indiana is not a strong land use planning state, meaning that there's very little zoning to help protect communities from this. And so what you see is this really unplanned and realistically expensive development pattern occurring where the taxpayers are asked to bear the benefit of what effectively amounts to private gain in a lot of these new development schemes. This is where I became really interested in this phenomena of these local grassroots initiatives and how collaboration or community-based environmental initiatives can make a real impact on both policy and actual land use patterns at the community level. And so, again, this is that literature review stage. This is where you're starting to look at what is a community-based environmental initiative. And a lot of this comes back to some core principles. So things like it takes a participatory approach to decision making. Right? This isn't a top-down mandated process, and so the only way to really come to decisions that are going to have the support to be implemented is to build that support from the beginning. Many times these are developed by groups of concerned citizens, and in this study in particular, I was working with the Harrison County Farm, Forest, and Open Space Task Force, and it was actually developed by a group of local farmers that started, that already had been meeting for the last, I'm going to say 30 years at a local diner for breakfast, a few mornings a week, started grumbling about what was happening with all the development, how it was making it more difficult to acquire farmland, to grow their operations, how they had a lot more conflict with urban neighbors or suburban neighbors, realistically, moving in, that were treating, that were ignoring trespass laws in Indiana, that lots and lots of other issues. And so somewhere in all of this came around to a dialogue. And so what they did is that they didn't stay narrowly focused just on the farming community, and they reached out. They reached out to real estate professionals from within the community. They reached out to local government. They reached out to a number of other civic institutions, so other nonprofits in the community, and they just started a collective discussion, right? Started pulling those resources together and bringing it back around. And functionally, what they did is they brought this back around to the focus on collaboration. Why collaborative natural resource management works is that by building that broad base of support, they actually did come up with more broadly accepted outcomes that we'll talk about a little bit later. And again, the bottom of the page here is just kind of looking through what does this process look like and some of the variables that may need to be considered as you start thinking about collaboration. And so this was just the kind of that initial pass to kind of make sense of that. Based on the model of collaboration at the bottom of the previous slide, what I did is that I worked to identify those variables that I thought were really key to understanding collaboration to protect farmland in this community. And for me, what it came down to is that if collaboration in the collaborative process, the reason for going through all of that work, and it can be significantly more work than a top-down approach, comes back around to what is the ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal for me is this acceptance of outcomes. And so you see that kind of here on the right, that all of these other steps in the collaborative planning process, so civic engagement, working to develop a common definition of the problem, building that capacity to collaborate and implement those solutions, all of that work ultimately for me leads to this acceptance of outcomes. And the way that I frame this in this study is that this is really key from the community's perspective, not just from those key individuals that are involved in the process, but at some level there has to be this broad-based support that extends beyond just those core group of people. And this goes back to that legitimacy of stakeholders. That's one of those components of Gray's model on the previous slide, is that the people involved really have to be representing the interests of the community. And that's what my study really dove into. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce it, and we'll walk our way through that. So I've already started to introduce the study through the previous slides, but I just want to go ahead and give you some, geographic context for where this study area is at. So Harrison County is the red county at the very southern part of Indiana, right along the Ohio River. It's a beautiful rural county. Corydon, the county seat, is a very small community, but at one point in time, and again this goes back to Indiana's settlement, at one point in time this was the first. I mean, it wasn't a state at that point in time, but it was the first territory capital for the state of Indiana, or what ultimately became the state of Indiana. But the interesting part about Corydon is that it's within the Louisville metropolitan region, and you can see that kind of the major roads that come are kind of outlined there in orange. And what's interesting to note is that Corydon is the only undeveloped county in the circle that surrounds of counties that surround Louisville. And so what I mean by that is that it doesn't actually have a direct bridge over the Ohio River to Louisville, which makes it somewhat unique. And that's helped buffer it from a lot of the development pressure over time. This is all changing as realistically land development has more or less filled up, as a term I don't like to use, but it's pretty accurate in this case, where the available land has been heavily developed in the surrounding counties, and Corydon and Harrison County are kind of the last open space for development in that metropolitan region. Just a couple key features of that growth. Just one of those things to consider is that 1990 to 2000, the county grew by 15%, which for a rural county in southern Indiana is a massive growth rate. And so, but again, the other thing to take a note here on this particular slide is that there's a lot of mix of really prime farmland, state forest land, and actually really exceptional privately owned forest land in this county as well. All of these concerns started to be brought to the surface as they kind of expanded out that working group and brought in others who were interested in this. I'm just going to go ahead and pause briefly here on this slide, just to let you know kind of the process of where things were at. Again, I've already mentioned this is kind of the best thing that the Farm, Forest, and Open Space Task Force did is that very early on they expanded out and kind of reached out to others and really had a broad range of stakeholder groups and citizen groups represented in this effort. So much so that in 2004, the county actually officially recognized them as a county initiative. And so the county actually signed off on this as a citizen-led initiative, and that had a real impact on where this work ended up going. The work of the task force really focused on two different things, and these get a little bit more complicated and kind of into the land use planning, the work that I do here at Stevens Point with the undergrads, but they really focused on passing two local policies. One of these is a voluntary purchase of development rights program, and basically this is an opportunity for a private landowner to, I'm going to say, effectively sell their development rights while retaining ownership of the property. And so what happens in this situation is that they sign a conservation easement that restricts future subdivision of the property and future development on the property. And so that's a really key part of that's a really key part of what they were trying to accomplish here. They also were developing, another mechanism that worked for a way for people to donate these conservation easements as well. And so those were the two different ordinances they were really working on. And as I mentioned here in October of 2006, which this survey I'm about to describe had something to do with passing this. It showed kind of the clear community support for this initiative. that the ordinances that they created for these purchase and development rights programs became the first in the state of Indiana and began enrolling farmland for permanent protection shortly thereafter. So the specifics on the survey was that I conducted a phone survey in July of 2006. I actually was able to hire a surveying group at Purdue University to conduct the survey for me. Basically, think of a telemarketing facility. If you've got to picture something in your mind, it's effectively what they did is they had employees that sat in cubicles that made the phone calls for me based on a random digit dial sample that included all Harrison County residents who were 18 and older. Ultimately, their efforts resulted in a 60% participation rate for the study, and what that meant for me was that I had almost 600 complete interviews, and I had 135 additional partial interviews. Present some issues down the road for how you analyze that data, but certainly I had this large sample, and again, a strong response rate. We did look at some of the non-response bias components, and there was no difference between the average county resident and the people responding to the survey. So again, not that much concern that we weren't representing the population of Harrison County accurately. This information was actually used by the county as they moved through the policy process to implement the purchase and development rights programs. And then jumping back to the model I introduced before. So these are the four these are four variable or latent constructs that I was really interested in measuring. And so certainly I pulled together a way of operationalizing each one of these constructs. And this was really the first of two analyses that I ran. And so this first step was really intended as a process of measure each one of these variables, and then use the dependent variable as acceptance of outcomes in a regression model to see if civic engagement, common definition of the problem, and capacity to collaborate actually have an influence on the acceptance of outcomes to protect farmland, forest, and open space in this county. And briefly, here's how I went about measuring some of these. Here are some of the examples of questions that were included in each of these measures. Obviously, these aren't all of the items that were included under each one of these, but you also see the scale reliability score, the Cronbach's alpha, that's associated with each one of these. And for a developmental study like this, these are very strong scale reliability scores. And so you can take a quick look at a couple of the items that I've used to measure each one of these latent constructs. Now, my purpose of presenting this slide isn't to try and teach you ordinary least squares regression in 30 seconds, which is what I'm trying to spend on each one of these slides. But it's to show you here are the results. And so for the dependent variable acceptance of outcomes, what I've got listed here on the left-hand side of this table is I've got a constant value. I've got the three independent variables: civic engagement, common definition of the problem, and commitment to collaborate. Ignoring for the moment everything else that's going on here, let's go all the way to the right side of this table and take a look at this quickly. What you see here is that all of those independent variables are significant, right? So they are significant and they're positive, right? So there's no negative signs in front of any of the coefficients that are provided here in the table, meaning that each one of these, civic engagement, common definition of the problem, and commitment to collaborate, are positive factors that influence support for acceptance of outcomes. When we look at the model fit summary, so that's the other thing to take a note when you look at regression models. The R squared here that's shown at the bottom of the table is 0.396. That means we explained almost 40% of the variance in our data. Now, in social science, the R squared values are one of those key values that sits out there, and 40% doesn't sound like we've explained a whole lot. But I'll tell you that in a lot of studies, you're shooting for 10 or 15% of the variance explained. We do not have a strong enough understanding of the relationships or There's other factors that we're not controlling for within our models, or other things that are occurring. And so when you see a model that gets above that 0.3, so that 30% of variance explained, you've got a model that's incredibly strong. The absolute strongest model I've ever seen in the social sciences is that family science researchers, so people who study family dynamics, have used intensive laboratory measurements of couples who are having problems, and they have, based on the variables they've measured, they can show about 80% accuracy in their predictions of divorce or not, or couples who will get divorced or will not. Again, that 80% mark is something that you're unlikely to ever see in the work that we do, and is the result of narrowing in on a few key variables within a very specific context over the course of 20 or 30 years of research. Again, so it's one of those things to keep in the back of your mind, is that a lot of times what we're really after is that we're after understanding an R-squared that shows us that we've explained some of the variance that exists, and we're trying to figure out if the variables, so the independent variables, so civic engagement, common definition of the problem, and commitment to collaborate, have a significant impact on the dependent variable, in this case acceptance of outcomes, and what's the directionality, positive or negative impact. That's a lot, and I said 30 seconds, and that's 3 minutes. But this is a tough slide, and this is why I would encourage you strongly to take some additional statistics courses as part of your graduate training. I mentioned that there were 2 different analyses that I conducted, and so I'm going to go ahead and just briefly introduce this here. This is much more complicated than I have time to focus on the rest of the study, but I do want to bring it back to some other social variables. And so the other part of this is that I had been working with this notion that sense of place, so an individual's, in this case, as I got more into sense of place, what I found is it's not one construct, it's actually 3 latent constructs. So an individual's place attachment, place identity, and place dependence have an impact on those steps, so the independent variables from the previous model, so the steps in the collaborative process, and on somebody's ultimate acceptance of the outcomes to protect farm, forest, and open space. So again, this is where I was starting to test specific hypotheses that place attachment, place identity, and place dependence have an impact on these key components of the collaborative planning process. Alright, so what you see in this table, and again, I apologize, I know there's a lot of information sitting here, but what you'll see in this table is 4 separate regression models. So these predictive models, each one, the dependent variable, so the variable that we're trying to look at, change in this variable is being caused by what? The dependent variable is each of the steps that we had talked about previously in the collaborative process. So civic engagement, common definition of the problem, commitment to collaborate, and acceptance of outcomes. What we see down the left-hand side is we see these other explanatory variables that we want to know what their role is in each one of these steps in the process. Again, this is trying to move us from just looking at this as a research study to how do we actually recruit, attract, retain people involved in this process, or maybe how can we replicate this or understand why things worked in this situation so that we can understand how to apply those in a future situation. And so what you see here is that sense of place variable I just described on the previous slide. I also included an environmental attitudes, again measured as a latent construct, so these are scaled items. I also looked at age, education, and political orientation as a component of this. And then the last one there is an interaction variable that's more complex than I want to get with this class, and so save that for another day. So things to look at real quickly. We talked about that explanatory power of these different models. And so if you look at my R-squareds, so down towards the bottom, it's actually there's 3 it's actually the second column or second row up from the bottom of the table is the R-squared. And so we see the first model only explained about 11% of the variance, and then we increased about 20% in the second model. We're up over that 30% mark in the third model, and we're back down to about 18% for looking at acceptance of outcomes. Again, this is that complexity of understanding social variables. But the other thing that you should note is things that jumped out is that sense of place was significant. And again, this is the asterisk that you're seeing up in the table itself. If you look at the sense of place variable and you look at how it performed in each one of these models, is that in 3 of the 4 models, it was a significant predictor of of civic engagement, of holding a common definition of the problem. Was not actually, but commitment to collaborate and ultimate acceptance of outcomes. Right, we're starting to those are those hypotheses that we laid out, that sense of place has a positive influence on each one of those steps in the process. And what we see is a significant positive relationship between sense of place and 3 of the 4 dependent variables. All right, so thanks for sticking with me through all of this. I hope this has started to clear up some of the process. Again, I'm trying to cram all of this into about 25 minutes, and to be honest, having given this lecture a number of times, this is more like an hour and a half discussion. But I hope I've hit kind of on those key elements here, right? The purpose of doing this work is that there was an applied policy problem. They were trying to develop a new land use policy for their county that ultimately ended up passing because of the support we were able to show for those acceptance of outcomes, right? The other thing that we've shown in this is that the first analysis clearly showed that the collaborative model that we're working with, that shows kind of these independent steps in the collaborative process being ultimately having a positive, significant relationship with the acceptance of outcomes, again, shows us that the process of collaboration we're looking with is actually something, and to be honest, the model performed really well, and so is actually giving us some insights into how this process needs to be structured if you're going to replicate it in other situations. And then finally, when we start to look at this influence of sense of place, we did see this, as I hypothesized, we did see this relationship, this positive significant relationship between sense of place and each one of these steps in the process, almost each 3 of those 4 steps in the process. And so what this means for us is that, how do we actually take this and make some recommendations? And so just a couple of real quick ones, because I know this video's gotten long, but one of the things that I took away from this is that sense of place and environmental attitudes are both really important for engaging the community in this dialogue. And so when it comes to looking at farmland, forest, or open space protection, you need to understand and engage the community in dialogues that focus both on environmental components, but also on the place-based components that will be impacted by whatever decisions are made. This place-based dialogue with community members really can help support and lead to the acceptance, broader acceptance of farmland preservation policies. The final meeting, I was able to attend the final meeting where the vote was held to approve the ordinances that created this farmland preservation program. And many of the people who'd taken the survey, again, there were, it's a community of 35,000, and between all of the responses, almost 750 people were involved in this process. A lot of people who'd taken the survey showed up to express their support and hadn't had any other way of hearing about it until they'd taken the survey. And so, again, some of what we're doing is doing active research. Some of what we're doing is that we're helping support, we're providing back some service to those that are willing to work with us in our own research. And then the final takeaway from this lecture, I hope what you really get out of this is that there's a lot of really exciting stuff you can do with quantitative analysis, but it's going to require you taking some additional coursework. Again, regression analysis is a phenomenal tool. But it's tough. It's a difficult process to learn, and there's a lot of underlying assumptions that have to be met and statistically tested in order to prove that your model is an accurate representation of the data. And so I guess I can't underscore this enough, that there's additional work in statistics that you'll need beyond this class to move from kind of that descriptive level, which I hope you've gotten really out of this class, to be able to feel comfortable doing that type of work, but to be able to move into that explanatory level where you're starting to look at these, relationships amongst variables and how we can actually use this information to show process, support, right, those other components that can help us build better environmental programming.